Well, Carol Lancaster, I'd like to begin with you. Let me get your sense of what you think in this presidential election year are the major foreign policy challenges for President Obama.
There are no lack of foreign policy challenges for the president. Some of them are going to be controversial in the election and others won't. I think everybody realizes that we have some flashpoints out there. Iran is a flashpoint. Bahrain is becoming a little bit of a flashpoint and is a very awkward one for the U.S. government since we have the Fifth Fleet, but we also have a value on democracy and political freedom. The death of the North Korean dictator and the transition to his son's leadership leave us really wondering where things will be going, and so that will be an ongoing challenge for the president. There are lots more, but I think one thing the president has said which is worth keeping in mind, it's not so much crisis-related as a longer-term vision, and that is what he has called a pivot toward Asia. As we leave Iraq and we leave behind what we're not so sure about in terms of peace or not peace, and as we prepare to withdraw, in some measure at least, from Afghanistan, then I think the president has rightly said we must turn our eyes to Asia, because in Asia there are many important things happening. Many of them have economic and political as well as security implications for the United States, and that, I think, is going to be the focal point of a lot of American attention going forward. It doesn't matter who's in the White House.
Turning to you, Anthony Clark Arend, anything to add or subtract to that list of major challenges and flashpoints?
Well, I think that's correct. I think clearly looking at Asia and trying to figure out a few things. One is, where's China going and how can we best engage China? What does it actually mean to engage China? I think the North Korean situation is not to be underestimated. Kim Jong-un is an uncertain character. We're not even sure precisely how old he is. Most press reports say in his 20s. It's clear that he's not pulling any levers. A lot of people opine that one of his uncles is actually playing sort of the major role behind the scenes. Kurt Campbell, American Assistant Secretary of State, recently cautioned China to exercise some kind of restraint on North Korea. In particular, there's a real concern that Kim Jong-un is going to try to consolidate leadership by making some kind of provocative overture toward the South. We're not really sure what that would be, but that might be the kind of thing to get his bona fides. And so that's something we're naturally worried about. Again, we don't know what China can do, but at least Assistant Secretary Campbell is opining that they should be a little more vigilant. So I think Asia really is an area that we're going to need to focus on. One thing that Carol and I have talked about in other contexts is Latin America, and in particular Mexico and the drug wars in that area of the world. While the U.S. has had to focus on Asia and on the crisis in Europe with respect to the euro, it seems as though the past several years Latin America has been neglected, Mexico in particular. And I think that's an area that cannot continue to go in this sense. And Carol might want to elaborate more on that, but I know that's something we agree on very strongly.
Well, I definitely want to get into Latin America. But before we do, back to you, Carol Lancaster, just to look at the challenges in the Middle East with respect to Iran, as well as the whole aftermath and fallout from the so-called Arab Spring, the democratic uprisings and the leftovers, the challenges, particularly with Syria, a festering conflict bordering on civil war. How do you think President Obama will be able to deal with these matters, particularly in the election year?
Yeah, you know, it used to be simple in the Middle East. It was just the Israeli-Palestinian tensions, and now we have a whole lot of other things going on, and they were never easy in the first place. I think that President Obama is going to be playing a close observation game, as it were, when it comes to Syria and Egypt and some of the other countries where there is seemingly a lot of turmoil and, in the case of Egypt, a political transition that isn't clear where it's exactly going. How much leverage the United States has in these situations is a real question. I think probably not a huge amount. We have the bully pulpit that has been used, but I think my own sense is that these are very important changes, but that the United States has, more than anything else, a watching brief, and that is, I think, the way the president is probably going to play it.
Anthony Clark Arend, how do you think President Obama is going to play this, the whole aftermath of the Arab Spring and the ongoing uprisings? I suggested in my introduction that U.S. diplomats are looking to engage some of the new so-called moderate Islamist parties that are coming into power in Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco. This is certainly going to affect U.S. foreign policy.
I think Carol is right. I think there's really not much else the president can do but to be very, very cautious, to get the best intelligence he can about some of the Islamic parties, the Muslim Brotherhood, and a variety of others, and try to move in a very deliberate fashion. This is not the time for any kind of grandstanding, nor is it the time to come out prematurely in support of a particular leader. People are going up and down. Egypt is still very, very much uncertain, and I think if the United States were to pin its hat next to a particular leader there, that could be extraordinarily problematic. One thing to note also about the Middle East is you mentioned Iran. Iran is a very strange place these days, and I should say perhaps that goes back beyond these days. But one of the real challenges now is there are these claims about potentially closing the Straits of Hormuz and how the United States should respond to that. The Department of Defense has come out very strongly and said if that were to happen, we would respond to maintain freedom of navigation through the Straits. It's a critical national security interest for not just the United States, but for the world. At the same time, there has for some months been floating around the idea of trying to engage in a preemptive strike against some Iranian nuclear sites. And more recently, one of our colleagues here, Matt Koenig, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where he claimed that now is the time to engage in such surgical strikes. And there's been some contention about whether the United States should do it, whether Israel should potentially engage in that. And I think this would be mistaken and would be a disaster if we were to do it. However, I would note, if Iran were to do something with respect to the Straits of Hormuz, that might be the kind of response that one would see either from the United States or Israel.